mute.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature, of which we are an integral part, with deep gratitude to all the generations before us that have led us to the present moment. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we embark on a 5-day program on science and consciousness. Over the past weeks, we've been hitting some pretty hard areas of human concern. We've looked at the global epidemic of mental health challenges for young people. We've looked at climate change and endangered species. We've looked at the crisis of democracy. We noted even as recently as last Friday, the US Supreme Court essentially abandoning a 50-year-old constitutional protection of a woman's right over her own body, and noted that democracy is in crisis globally. This week, we want to step back and not deal with the very specific challenges that are confronting humanity and the human community, but we want to look at the general field of science and consciousness, knowing that how we perceive the world, what the state of our consciousness is, determines to a very significant degree what we think, what we say, and how we act. So the question of science and consciousness is an indirect way to support the global challenge confronting all of us, and that is for humanity to rise at this critical moment and fashion a new future, more aligned with natural ecosystems and more abundant, more healthy, and more contributive to the well-being of our children under the the 7th generation. So that's our subject matter for the week, everyone. And we're going to start, as we always do, by just centering ourselves for just a minute. Centering yourself in your body. Our bodies are nature. Closing your eyes if you can and placing your attention on your heart. And for the next minute or so, attuning yourself to your heart in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving, and holding everyone on this broadcast, holding us all with the same consciousness of love and affection and nurturing. Thank you, everyone. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Peter Merry. Peter Merry is the Chief Innovation Officer for Ubiquiti University and has been the creative mind that has helped shape the university and the company and our community from the very beginning when we were founded back in 2012. Peter has stepped forward and offered to convene a whole week on science and consciousness, given that that's his passion. That was the focus of his PhD dissertation that he wrote for Ubiquiti. So Peter, I'm delighted to be able to welcome you back to Humanity Rising, and I turn the program over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. And good to be back. Hello, everybody. And yeah, so why this week on science and consciousness? Well, last year, Ubiquiti convened the first science and consciousness event at the beautiful Broughton Sanctuary in Yorkshire, the UK. Together with the International Consciousness Research Laboratories, ICRL, who were the people who took on the work that came from the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research pair, the lab that Brenda Dunn had led together with Bob Yan. And through a bunch of synchronicities, we all contrived to get the equipment that they had developed at Princeton to measure how your mind influences the world around you. And we'd contrived to get that to Yorkshire. And so we're re-establishing the equipment from Princeton in a space we've called the Weird Experience, so that people can have a direct experience of how their mind is influencing the world around them. And the reason that I decided to put time and energy into that in the context of everything one could be doing, given what's going on in the world at this time, is that my sense is that the essence of all of our challenges is how we have essentially forgotten the nature of our interconnectedness as humanity. That if we hadn't forgotten that we're the earth, basically, this is the earth talking to itself. If we hadn't forgotten that we were the earth, we hadn't forgotten the deep interconnectedness between all of us, we'd never been able to would have been able to do what we've done to other life forms on the planet and to each other. So the question becomes, how do you help people remember that interconnectedness? And, you know, our mainstream has gotten to the place where we've put a lot of weight on science, the things we can measure and the things we can see. And so one of the things that really excited me about the work at Princeton was the fact that 28 years of research at one of the top university engineering departments had shown beyond statistical doubt that our mind does in fact influence the world around us. And so the ability to use science to bridge the gap, let's say, between the mainstream and the more spiritual or conscious community seemed to me a great opportunity, because when you're confronted by a direct experience using equipment that is kind of formally recognized as scientific, then it's harder for your rational mind to deny the reality of that experience. So that was what led us to initiating the Science and Consciousness event last year to launch the Weird Experience Lab, and Lynn McTaggart joined us, as well as many scientists from around the world, including Brenda Dunn, who made it over. And unfortunately, Brenda passed away 10 days or so ago. And yeah, her son, Jeff, said after that, where we, Ubiquiti, awarded her an honorary PhD for her work, all the men who were working around her had had their PhDs. She was the only one with no PhD. So we awarded her an honorary PhD, and we named a room after her at the Weird Experience, which she was very touched by. And so Jeff felt this sense of closure had also been, achieved in her life as well. So we are running a science and consciousness event again this year, building on the research that has been going on in the meantime. Some remarkable outcomes, which, some of which we'll talk about on Friday, including measurements in the field when somebody actually passes away and leaves their body. We're actually able to see that happen in an instrument that has no physical connection to the person at all of which is showing us there's something else going on than just this material reality that we see around us. So in that context, we thought it would be great to do a Humanity Rising week with some of the people involved in the Science and Consciousness event, to share some of their thinking and warm us up a bit for the in-person event happening end of October, beginning of November in the UK. And when thinking about the program, I thought it would be great this first session to have some people who have were there kind of in the early days, the early days of this kind of parapsychology movement, where people are trying to understand what is this psychic work, what's going on here, how do we understand, how do we make sense of it, and as just so happens, Jim Hickman, my colleague at Ubiquiti here, was one of those people involved very much in the early days of this work. And when I talked to him about it, he was excited to contribute. And he said to me, well, around that time, I was also very involved with Stanley Krippner, who was an early pioneer as well. So could we involve him as well? I said, of course, that would be fantastic, Jim. And so, but Stanley couldn't make this time in person. So Jim and I had a conversation with him last week, which we recorded, which we're going to share with you and then move on into a further dialogue. So Jim, would you like to kind of turn your video and unmute and come on in and say hi, and maybe just a little bit of an introduction, and then we can lead into our conversation with Stanley.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And I think by way of introduction, I will go back 45 years to when Stanley and I first began working together, and recognizing that was 20 years after he began working on all of these things, as you'll hear more from Stan. But in 1969, Stan invited me to become a research assistant at the Dream Laboratory, where he was conducting ESP experiments with talented individuals. And that began a kind of arc for me from then on to become very involved in a wide variety of the science of consciousness, we might say, and how to apply it in our lives. So that now a part of my work at Ubiquiti is teaching applied neuroscience, because as we have seen over these years, the understanding of how the brain, mind, heart works is an essential element of understanding how, from our inside, we can influence the outside world and our experience of it, which brings us back to parapsychology. Because in the early days, the late 60s, for example, the focus, as Peter has just described, was on finding individuals who have a talent at controlling the experience of gaining information or affecting matter at a distance in a way that the science of those years could not explain. And that's what Stanley and I worked on together. And just a brief background to what Peter was saying, one of the early experimenters in psychokinesis was a man named Helmut Schmidt. And he developed the first, what we called the PK machine, which was a small a box with 4 lights on it. And the electronic signal that lit up the lights was stimulated by strontium-90. Possibly the most random event in nature is the electronic system that comes out of a strontium decay, for example. And over time, we found a variety of people who could put order into the randomness of the radioactive decay. And the further development of that was done by Bob John of Princeton, which took it way beyond what Schmidt and others did, and is now available, as Peter said, in the United Kingdom. And Peter will talk much more about that. But I bring it up because it's an essential aspect of the early research by the Soviets. And a part of our conversation here is what was going on in the Soviet Union. And of course, this is before the Soviet Union was dissolved and became Russia, and the US military and intelligence communities. And there's a good book written by a Pulitzer Prize winning author, Annie Jacobson, in which she summarizes the 40-year history. And remember, for 40 years, both the Soviets and the US military and intelligence communities were researching and applying parapsychological phenomena, let's say. And so I just wanted to make one note that came out of some of the Schmidt stuff. As we know, the brain operates also on an electronic impulse, where electronic signals are issued from various organs in the brain, tissues. And so the Soviets' approach was mostly application, not just trying to prove it. Where in the US, there was so much disregard for what the science was trying to find out. And most people were sort of opposed to the whole idea and said it was all fraudulent. But in the Soviet Union, for example, Stanley and I spent time at the Siberian Academy of Sciences, talking and meeting with some of the researchers that were involved in Soviet parapsychology. And one of the things we were informed about was 2 applied experiments in going on in the Soviet Union. One, as some of you may remember, the Soviets were champion chess masters. And one of the things they did was take several people who seemed to be good at affecting the radioactive decay of materials to put order into randomness, and having them concentrate on the opposition, not to try and influence their move, but knowing that if they were able in some way to affect the electrical activity of the brain, maybe they would not be able to make the right move in the chessboard, let's say. So to put that further, in the Kremlin, they actually created a model of the president's office in the White House. And they did the same thing. They had about 5 or 6 psychics 24 hours a day focusing on a man who was sitting in the president's chair in their model, who was pretending to be the US president. And again, the attempt was to just affect the electrical activity of the brain of the president in such a way that if and when he was looking at certain things related to US-Soviet relations, maybe he would get a little bit confused and not make the kind of move that would be deleterious to the Soviet interests. So Peter can say more about what now has developed out of this kind of research. And the last thing I'd say as we begin to introduce Stan is 2 things. One of the most well-known parapsychologists of that time and throughout history is a man named Dr. Charles Tart, who was at the University of California, Davis, when he did a lot of his research, as one of the most highly regarded psychologists. And his first book in 1969, called Altered States of Consciousness, became, in which he edited, became one of the textbooks for modern psychology. And Tart once said, Stan Krippner belongs on the Mount Rushmore of parapsychology. In other words, he's one of the greatest researchers of all of history. Now, the other side of this was, as I said, lots of people were trying to prove all of this was wrong. And among those were magicians who were very good at sleight of hand. The premier magician of that time was named Randy, the amazing Randy. And he was well known for reproducing experiences and events that the psychic research said were psychic. And he could do it all by sleight of hand. So he was out there showing that everything the researchers were saying were not true because he could reproduce it. At the same time, he said that I can depend on Stan Krippner as an unbiased observer and researcher. He's probably the only researcher, Stanley, that Randy ever complimented in this regard. So it's just a measure of the reputation and the quality of the work that was done, that has been done by Stan Krippner. And I was always honored to be both a friend and associate of his over the last 45 years that we've known each other. Peter?
Great, thanks, Jim. What a great introduction. A lot of that I didn't know you, so it's nice, it's nice just to have this time to hear you tell those stories as well, stories I haven't heard, so fantastic. So Georg, I suggest what we do now is we play the interview with Stanley, and then Jim and I will pick it up afterwards. So are you able to get that going? Here we go. There we go, look at that. Jim's even synced it so well. He's wearing the same shirt.
Here with an eclectic global crowd on Humanity Rising, and we're so glad and honored that you were able to make some time for us to record this presentation for the group that's now assembled live to hear about, you know, Stanley Krippner, the legendary parapsychology pioneer. And I was saying to Peter the other day, you know, Stan, your first, what we're calling anomalous experience, was in 1946. That's a year before I was born. I had no idea it went back that far. But Stanley, why don't you start off with, you know, some of those stories in the sense of, you know, what has happened in your life, how it then moved you into, in a sense, a lifetime of studying consciousness in a wide variety of ways, and very particularly the kind of parapsychological experiences, events, anomalous things that have happened, and to some degree, what it means for all of us, for yourself, for us, and we'll ask you a few questions along the way. Is that okay, Stan?
That's just fine. Tall order. Let's see what happens. Right. I hope I do you justice.
Okay.
Actually, to answer your question succinctly, yes, in 1946, I was very disappointed because my parents did not have enough money to buy me a set of World Book Encyclopedia that my aunt was selling. $100 for the complete set, which in those days was a lot of money, and my parents, being farmers, simply didn't have it. And I went up to my room and I was so sad, and I was thinking, well, who can I borrow the money from? I have one rich relative, or at least fairly rich relative. That's my Uncle Max, who works for a dairy corporation near Madison, Wisconsin. And then I thought, no, I cannot ask Uncle Max because he's dead. I don't know how that thought popped into my mind, but it did. But remember, I was in a state of high emotion at the time. And we know that high emotion often characterizes these spontaneous psychic experiences. So anyway, I heard a scream and I ran downstairs to see if my mother had fallen or something. And she said, "Your Uncle Max has just died." So that, of course, came as a surprise. And I only told a few people about it out of fear that they would think that either I was lying or this was some sort of a bizarre satanic diabolical power that I had. And yet I began to read about the topic. And at that time, there was a radio show with the famous mentalist, Joseph Dunninger, and I listened to it avidly. It was years later that I discovered that Dunninger was a very clever magician and mentalist, and that what he was doing on the show was a very, very sophisticated sleight of hand. He also did this on television years later. And then years after that, much to my surprise and other synchronicity, I actually met him at a magician's show that a psychiatrist friend of mine had taken me to, and my psychiatrist friend knew Dunninger. So I finally had a chance to tell him that he and his show had triggered my interest in parapsychology after all those years. So I went to the University of Wisconsin, and I became a member of the Union Forum Committee, which brings speakers. And I said, well, why don't we bring a mentalist like Joseph Dunninger or Franz Polgar? I named a couple of people. And then my supervisor said, don't you realize that these are all magicians? This is all show business? And I took her word for it. And of course, she was right. And then another nice coincidence, I was taking a philosophy course by Campbell Garnett, a famed philosopher in those days. And he told the class about how these psychic experiences being explored scientifically in North Carolina by Joseph Banks Rhine and his wife, Louisa E. Rhine, at their parapsychology laboratory. Well, then I did some research to find out what they were doing. And I got our committee to invite J.B. Rhine to speak. And we couldn't get much money because all of the departments that could have given us money said we don't want anything to do with that pseudoscience. And so Ryan said, if you can pay my expenses, I'll take a train from Madison to Wisconsin after I finish addressing the American Chemical Society in Chicago. So that's how we got J.B. Rhine to come to the campus. And again, much to faculty disparagement, at least in psychology, one faculty member said, if you're interested in parapsychology and any of that other BS, you can hear it from the horse's mouth by going to hear J.B. Rhine tomorrow night. And then another professor said, if you invite Rhine to speak, you should also invite Father Divine to speak on recent advances in the art of healing. Father Divine was a famous faith healer in those days. Now, interestingly enough, I actually spent some time with both of those professors of psychology years later, and we had very amiable discussions. Of course, I didn't mention what I had known from years before, but I did record it, and I wrote it down in several places, so it's a matter of record. So that's a short version of the story. Now, let me go one step further. I found out that other friends of mine had had those experiences, and they also said, well, we don't dare tell anybody about it because they'll think that we're making it up or they'll think that I'm psychotic and hallucinating. And so one of my motives in studying parapsychology was to show that this isn't really paranormal at all. It's normal in the expanded sense of the word. And of course, there's no good evidence that most people who have these psychic experiences have any type of psychopathological predisposition for it. So there you have it.
Jim, you're muted.
Stan, two things stand out, and one I'd like you to elaborate a little more on. But first, it's interesting that, as you put it, over time, people whom you knew at one point and then met again years later have a different perspective on the same topic, in a sense. And, you know, it's been my experience that throughout life, we begin to integrate more of some of what might have been the edge into mainstream. I mean, and we look at other aspects of science, and we know that's true, quantum physics and neuroscience. You know, when I took my first brain physiology course, probably a senior in high school, I was told that by the time you're 23, the brain is set for the rest of your life. Right. And now we know you can change it until you die. And so it's just interesting that over time, if we give ourselves the opportunity to both learn and reflect, then going back to part of the purpose of this discussion, parapsychology and its effects, in a sense, can bring more meaning into our lives today than it might have 30 years ago. And so I just wonder if you'd comment on that for a minute.
Yes, of course, that's very well put. I'll give you another example. When I was at the University of Wisconsin taking psychology courses, dreams were mentioned by only one professor. And he said, anybody who dreams in color is psychotic. This is a red flag that the person might be schizophrenic or have some other psychosis. He didn't even say neurotic, psychotic. Well, that's a big, heavy word. To be honest, and my friends and I were all looking at, oh, we all dream in color. Does that mean they're schizophrenic? Obviously, we didn't believe him. And again, I ran into that same professor years later when we were both teaching at Kent State University. No, I did not mention the earlier comment he made.
Yeah.
And hopefully he had done some reading since that time. I don't know. So yes, things change over time. And again, once it was admitted that dreaming in color is not a sure sign of schizophrenia, then another problem came up where some leading neuroscientists are saying, well, dreaming is nonsense. It's just a random collection of images with no meaning. But now we've got ample experimental evidence to debunk that. When people have some sort of a conflict, they tend to dream about that conflict or possible solutions to that conflict. When people have a big event coming up, they're likely to dream about preparations for that event because dreams help us prepare for the future. And also, the main function of dreams is to consolidate memories and regulate emotions. And that, of course, is tied to daily events. So those are just a couple of experiences I've run into where what was dogma at one point was shattered and replaced at another point.
And so you mentioned two things that I would like you to comment on. One, when you're talking about dreams, you're obviously talking about what we now call an altered state of consciousness. And when I was working with you at the Menninger Dream Laboratory in Brooklyn, back in the 69, 70, we looked at several different ways of affecting telepathic communication in altered states of consciousness. And one of those, as you remember, was we did a series of experiences at the Grateful Dead concerts. And it's hard to find a crowd of 20,000 people who are in such an altered state as all the kids at a Grateful Dead concert. So I just wonder if you might talk a little bit more, because it plugs into your point about high emotion and Uncle Max, and what are the elements here that might, facilitate this in every one of us to some degree, and the altered states that you've explored with, under scientific conditions that have really shown how some of this supposed psychic phenomena actually can exist.
Oh, that's a very good comment. For the listeners who don't know about the Grateful Dead concert, maybe they don't even know the Grateful Dead. It's a popular rock group. But the leader of the group, Jerry Garcia, came to me and said, we're going to be doing 6 nights at Portchester, New York, and maybe we could do a long distance telepathy experiment. I said, well, that's a great idea. And so I made all of the necessary arrangements in terms of random selection of a painting that would be shown on the screen once the Grateful Dead were about an hour into their gig. And by that time, the members of the audience were in profound altered states, not only from their emotion, but from LSD, from marijuana, who knows what else. And so when they saw a sign flashing on the screen, you're about to participate in a telepathy experiment, well, why not? In their altered state, anything was possible. So they were focusing on trying to send a photograph to the English psychic Malcolm Besant, who was at Maimonides in the Dream Laboratory. And again, the pictures that we chose of the experiment, we tried to take high emotional pictures. So even if the person was not emotional, him or herself, they would still make a connection to something emotional. Well, the whole point is that Malcolm Besant did very well. And of course, you squared Malcolm Besant around New York City so he didn't run wild or get lost. And you got him to the, as they say, you got him to the church in time, and he performed extremely well. Now, that was a 6-night study. Our usual studies are 8, 9, or 10, 11, or 12 nights. So this is sort of a pilot study. And yet we got substantial results. And now that little study is getting more publicity than any of our other more rigidly controlled studies, including a 50-year gig at the Portchester Theater, where some of the original ticket holders came to listen to a different rock musician, Billy Strings. And of course, they didn't have a telepathy experiment, but it was nice that we did the observance. So this is sort of an example of how one of the things we did got into one aspect of the mainstream, at least the cultural mainstream.
Can I ask something on building on that, Stanley? While we were at the Science and Consciousness last year, we did a small remote perception experiment that wasn't, under scientific conditions or anything, but we had half the group were in the woods and they just done a forest bathing experience. So it's a kind of heighten their senses, as it were. And they had to pick 1 out of 20 pictures. And at some point they picked a picture, and their task was to try to send it back to the other half of the group who were in the conference room. The other half of the group, were trying to pick it up, and they, as they described it and wrote things down. And when we came back and compared notes earlier, it was pretty clear that there was some fairly accurate hits on what they sent. But the interesting thing was that we asked them to try, the people in the conference room, to try to pick up the image 30 minutes before the group had even chosen the picture. Because this was what, during Brenda's work, they'd actually found it to be more effective when they did it outside of linear time, as it were. I just wondered if any kind of, and obviously there wasn't a high emotional state that the senders were in, but we had helped to kind of connect them to nature, as it were, which I guess put them in a different state of some kind.
Oh, well, that was a very noble attempt. I'm glad to hear the results. And of course, we did 2 precognitive dream studies with Malcolm Besant in our laboratory at Maimonides Medical Center, both of which got extremely high results, better results than what had been done in the ordinary waking state in regular time. So what you mentioned is certainly borne out by my experience also, yes. And again, putting this into the context of people's lives, some people, when they have a dream that comes true, especially a sad dream that comes true, they, oh my God, I caused that. I must have caused my cousin's death, or I must have caused that bridge to collapse. Of course, that's nonsense. You cannot logically make that connection. But again, when people have a bizarre experience, they sometimes jump to very illogical conclusions. So again, the more this type of information is disseminated, people will not think that they're bizarre or crazy. They will not think that they're causing a problem. They'll simply accept this as one of many, many human experiences. Mm-hmm. And in the last analysis, a spontaneous case like this doesn't always bear up. The dream about the future doesn't always come true. The telepathy attempt doesn't always represent what another person is doing. So this is not a 100% guaranteed method of communicating or finding things out. I think that there's no harm in people getting together and trying to send healing to a person who's ailing, even if the attempt is not scientific, and even if the attempt has undetermined origins. Sometimes that person actually feels better. Maybe it's just the thought that so many people are caring for that person. So I don't discourage this from happening at all. Sometimes it's not so important that we know all of the causes of an effect, but we appreciate the effect itself.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, and Stanley, I appreciate how you differentiate between our capacity to perceive versus our belief that, oh God, I did that. Because our perceptual possibilities are so much greater than what we normally imagine within ourselves. And I just wanted your brief comment on, you know, when we talk with others. I mean, my view is that most of us have these deeper and broader perceptual capabilities that, for a wide variety of reasons, the culture, our upbringing, belief systems, etc., don't actually manifest. And do you think it actually is only certain very skilled people that can do this? Or is there an element within each one of us that actually can, you know, be a part of a larger, in a sense, playing field that, you know, where we can dream about something in advance?
Well, I think like so many other human traits, there's what we call a normal distribution of psychic capacities. A few people having virtually no psychic experiences, a few people having a lot of psychic experiences, and the rest of us falling sort of in the middle. And in our work at Maimonides, as you remember, sometimes we work with people who actually were established psychic senses, like Malcolm Besant. Other times, no, it was people who were very much interested in the topic, who were open-minded to the possibilities, and their enthusiasm was enough to sort of carry things through. So, yeah, so we worked with groups of people. And again, the folks who were listening to the to our dialogue, it's very important to realize that there is a wide range of human potentials. And sometimes the human potentials are never realized because we're not living in the part of the world where they're necessary, such as tracking game or sensing when rain is coming, or some of the abilities that people in indigenous societies have perfected. Well, we have those same capacities, so they're all part of the human condition, all human Homo species, Homo sapiens species, but we're not called upon to maximize those very rudimentary capacities. Just as people who in indigenous societies are not called upon to solve high-level mathematical problems because that's not necessary for them to survive in their environment. We have to remember that for traits to be passed on, they have to have survival value. In evolution, something does not get passed on if it doesn't have survival value. There might be a few idiosyncratic people who have those abilities, but they'll die out over time if they're not passed on.
Can I just build on that, Stanley, and ask, one of the reasons I started to get involved with this, I've been doing a lot of work with kind of highly complex systems, lots of multi-stakeholder organizations, blah, blah, blah. And at some point I felt to me that the complexity was reaching the limits of our rational mind, that we simply couldn't grasp all of the complexity rationally, which is what pushed me into, well, there must be some, they talk about some simplicity, the other side of that complexity. And it made me realize that there was, maybe other intelligences we needed to work with to be able to get more of a feeling for the whole, as it were, rather than an attempt to analyze it and put all the pieces together. And because it feels to me that that is right now a survival need for us collectively to be able to kind of sense from the whole, as it were, if we're really going to be able to co-create or emerge the solutions that are needed to many of our problems today. Would you recognize that? Would you say that maybe one of the reasons that there is more interest in this now is because it is people are recognizing that remembering our interconnectedness and being able to, I guess, communicate with more of reality than we might normally do with our rational mind is actually becoming a survival imperative?
Oh, I think this is a good point. For example, people in the Western world until recently had no notion of ecology. They were out to master nature, to exploit nature. Now we realize that this is destructive. Those people had the genes, the genetic material that indigenous people had. Indigenous people who lived in nature, of course, had to take care of the environment. Not all of them did, so I don't want to romanticize indigenous people, but for the most part, they knew how to take care of the environment. So-called civilized people in the Western world lost that trait, but it was still there. And now I think it's coming back. I think that I want to embroider on what Jim said a moment ago. When he was studying neurosciences, and I remember this too, we were told you have a number of neurons in the brain, they're there, you cannot change them, you can only hope that they don't die out. Now we know that the brain is flexible enough to create new connections, even new neurons all the time. Another thing that was hotly denied years ago, children of the Holocaust survivors often had symptoms of trauma that their parents had. And then the conventional answer, well, of course, the parents talked about the Holocaust and the children internalized this. No, this happened even when the children were adopted out or when their parents died early. And now we're finding out that sometimes the grandchildren are having the same traits. This is now called epigenetics. And people would have denied the possibility of epigenetics only a few decades ago. So you can see how our conception of the neurosciences keeps changing, even in the mainstream. And of course, someday the mainstream will be incorporating psychic abilities simply because they have to, because this will help explain other elements of neurology.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, a related, if I could, Peter, quickly, a related example, Stanley, is a group that you're semi-affiliated with called Dancing with the Trickster. And as I understand it, this is an attempt to gather what is being called anomalous psychic experiences among people everywhere. Can you say something about this?
Well, yes, if people want to look Dancing with the Trickster up on the website, this is in the internet, this is a website where people with unusual experiences can contribute their experiences to the website, either under their real name or under an assumed name. And the people who are pulling this together have two goals in mind. First of all, is to show people that they are not alone. They're not the only ones who are having weird experiences. And secondly, this is to collect a database that then can be used to compare it with earlier databases. And so, and also, once we get enough people coming in, to see if there are gender differences, age differences, ethnic differences, socioeconomic differences, and all the other markers that one might want to make a comparison for. Yeah, so it's on the internet, Dancing with the Trickster, and we encourage you to send in your own experiences and add them to the composite.
That's great. That's great, Stanley. And we'll make sure we put the website into the chat during the Humanity Rising session. If I go more, can I do one last question, Jim, and then we'll kind of wrap up?
Yeah, let me just make one comment following up on what Stanley said and what you said. You see, to me, this database that is increasing with participants, ordinary people who have anomalous, somewhat psychic experiences, is an example, Peter, of what you were saying. The larger frame is expressing itself in a more tangible way, let's say, than it has in the past. And that may be driven by our absolute need, because it contributes to a different way of seeing the planet and our relationship with Mother Nature, and who we have to become to create a resilient and regenerative civilization for us. So I appreciate that both of you were pointing this out, and that it is relevant to our present lives, all of us who are on this call. Yeah. Back to you, Peter.
Yes, absolutely. And the sooner people realize that we're all connected at deep psychic and psychological levels, who knows, this might even get them to think twice before they engage in acts of random terrorism, is bedeviling the United States now, or even warfare, as you see with the Russians and Ukrainians killing each other, even though they're connected at a very, very deep level. From our point of view, this makes no sense. And eventually, we hope that humanity will wake up to this issue before it's too late.
Yeah, at the end of last year's conference, Science and Consciousness Conference, Stanley, which we called the Weird World of Mind and Matter, we concluded that what we needed to start to do is just to stop trying to prove this to ourselves anymore and just assume that it is the case,
right?
That things are interconnected in this way, and this dimension of reality exists in us and around us. And so the theme of this year's conference is making weird the norm. Right. So what does it mean if we assume that weird, W-Y-R-D, this web of interconnectedness, is actually the norm? So that's how I think we then start to, like you say, shift our reality in terms of the way we choose to show up and behave and the actions we take, because of the way we're experiencing and understanding the world around us. So I wanted to ask you as a last question, after these many years of incredible work that you've been doing, it's not a small question, but how would you now describe, like if you had your grandchild on your knee or something, how would you now describe the nature of reality based on everything you've learned over the last years?
I don't think my pay grade is quite up to giving a good answer to the question. But because we don't have much time left, that gets me off the hook. I think the most important aspect of the nature of reality that I can offer is that consciousness is fundamental. That consciousness, however you want to describe the term, was there originally. The Big Bang came out of consciousness. No, consciousness was not one of the things that eventually came out of the Big Bang. Consciousness was there indefinitely and will still be there even when human beings in their present form no longer wander the face of the earth. The consciousness, the underlying fabric of reality will maintain itself, and what we're dealing with now are little blips in that ocean of reality, little waves that pop up and then go back to the totality. But I think that's the best answer I can give to your question.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, Stanley.
Yeah, thank you, Stan, and have a good Should we make a few comments, Peter, before we kind of engage with the listeners?
Sure, Jim. Is that something?
Yeah, there are two things I
start?
wanted to point out here. One is just my own little way of looking at this. As Stanley said in the end, consciousness may be the principal constant in all of this. Out of some level of consciousness, in a sense, matter arises. In investigating neuroscience, especially what Stanley and some of the commenters referred to as neuroplasticity in the brain, which means that with appropriate attention and intention, in a sense, the role the mind plays, we can restructure both the form and the function of our brains. And there are a variety of influences that participate in that, but the primary one is, first, you have to believe that you can, and you have to want to do that. And then there's a series of exercises to focus, in a sense, our mind-heart system in a way that changes, literally, the function and form of the brain. And I kind of refer to that as an innate psychokinesis. In a sense, the mind is designed in a way to use what we refer to as PK on our entire physical system. It's where consciousness and matter begin to interact. So in a sense, we have it built into us, as Stanley and Peter and were pointing out. There's an inherent capacity within us, and then we learn more and more how to actually move that capacity into the external world, which is what Peter was pointing to, and Stan was commenting on toward the end, that our role in now recreating a kind of civilization that honors Mother Nature, that is collaborative rather than competitive, et cetera, is essential now in moving ourselves forward. The last thing I wanted to mention, and I don't want this to be the last thought, but it's important to acknowledge, as I said in the very beginning, the Soviets, and now we know the US military intelligence community, have for quite a long time explored how to use these powers in a military sense, in a way that supports our national security interests, way that we use it in a sense against our quote enemy. And as I mentioned, if you're interested in that, and I'll put the reference in the chat here, Annie Jacobson has a book out that shows the 40 years of research in the US government, et cetera. What's happened most recently goes a step further, because as we've learned more and more, both about how the brain works when a psychically talented person exercises his or her talent, and how the brain works now in registering our thoughts as electrical impulses that can be monitored and understood very significantly as the thought of the person being monitored. There is a new thrust in the military community that, in a sense, is combining technology and mind reading. They call it neuroweapons. And they, in a certain way, it's referred to as technology facilitated telepathy. And here's what happens, because it's being used now. The commander of the forces, standing back at the headquarters, thinks about the strategy to be employed by his or her soldiers. And the commander wears a kind of transceiver that can detect those thoughts as electrical impulses. And then that transceiver broadcasts those electrical signals to the men and women in the battlefield who are wearing a special technical device that receives those electrical signals and translates them into thoughts in the mind of the people on the battlefield. And this is now being deployed so that we have begun to connect technology with our understanding of how the brain, mind, heart system reflects thoughts, emotions, and other related functions in ways that we can now use what is being called technology facilitated telepathy. And it's a whole area of neuroweapons. And one of the men who talks about this very, very cogently says that we will encounter some form of neurocognitive science that has been weaponized in our personal and professional lives. And if you want to see a YouTube by James Giordano, I'm putting that now in the chat as well, so that you can actually hear him lecture on how the brain is becoming the battlefield of the future. So Peter, I just wanted to throw that in. So we're aware of the interface between this science of the brain, mind, heart system, extraordinary psychic capacities, which, as you and Stan pointed out, may reside within all of us in a certain way, that are now being kind of semi-deployed through our understanding of the brain and technology, et cetera, as neuroweapons for the future of the battlefield. But I don't want to end on that negative comment, though it's an important aspect of all of this for us to remember that, you know, we're in a world in which that aspect of life is being deployed and experimented with significantly.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jim. Well, at one level, scary. At another level, I guess the good news is that if the military is accepting it as part of reality, then an acceptance of the idea of us being interconnected, you know, beyond the ways we currently think we are, and an acceptance of the brain extending, or the mind extending beyond just the brain, which our materialist science has insisted on so far, that belief is kind of almost undeniable now, if we're starting to, you know, if it's starting to be deployed in that way. On the other hand, you know, as ever with a technology or a way of doing things, there are different things that can be done with it. I know that one of the reasons that they weren't really able to deploy the kind of psychic remote viewing properly in the Cold War was because the hit rate, wasn't high enough. They weren't able to be sure. Maybe it would be like 50–60% of the time they'd get it right. And if they were using that information to decide where they were going to drop a bomb, it wasn't reliable enough for them to be able to use. So in that sense, that kind of canceled out that possibility, although the ability to receive information about something, I think, was higher. Now, as we've been contemplating, with the weird experience at Broughton and with this little company we're setting up called Weirder Tech, how we could use this stuff in a positive way. One of the ideas we have, based on some work that did come out of the Princeton research, where they developed these mind lamps, which are lamps you can influence the color of with your intention. With the new technology that we're developing, we, for example, will be able to create something which is like a pair of lamps, where if you have one of the pairs in your house and I have one of the other pair in my house, and I start to think of you, then your lamp will start to glow in your house. So imagine the kind of impact of that in our COVID times, where everybody thought the biggest impact beyond the physical was this mental and emotional sense of isolation, which of course is an illusion, because we know actually we're deeply interconnected. So if you had a lamp in your room that glowed every time somebody thought of you, then you'd be constantly reminded of the underlying interconnectedness, that we aren't actually alone. So I think there are ahead of us many exciting possibilities in terms of the way we'll be able to create technologies that basically just remind us of the innate interconnectedness that we the innate nature of interconnectedness that we are. That our current culture, education, and materialist science has kind of drummed out of us. It was like, say, earlier on in the chat, we got onto that theme and this idea that we have these gating mechanisms that basically just close out a lot of that information that we actually all have access to, that we need to learn to unlock, which are gated because of the beliefs that we've kind of been indoctrinated into us about what is real, what we can and what we can't do. And then, of course, there's going to be positive and negative uses of that as we go along, I guess.
Well, and another comment, Peter, stimulated by some of the comments in the chat. One person pointed out the experiments that were done with transcendental meditation, the Maharishi, that and it was conducted under the design of a physicist, a scientist who really looked at the following information, what they did, and it's relevant to everything that's being said here in the chat. Again, it's a part of the early history. Groups of TM practitioners would come together at a certain time for a certain length of time and practice transcendental meditation for an agreed upon amount of time. And, to summarize it briefly, over the time these experiments were conducted, they found that the crime rate in those areas of that city were reduced significantly. And it was a part of the demonstration that there is an element of calm and order rather than chaos, and effect of our inner intention that affects the external world in a significant way. So when we look at many of the comments that listeners are putting in the chat, we find that lots of people are involved now in either organizations, initiatives that are using, in a sense, our capacity to visualize, to imagine, to what Stanley was saying, immerse oneself in that fundamental consciousness out of which all of this arises in a way that hopefully will contribute to a different kind of world emerging. And this is one of the most important parts of the purpose of this talk, Peter, to show where parapsychology in the early years, 50 years ago, has come through the integration of, in a sense, other consciousness studies by a number of different people with different approaches to apply to our daily life now, and how we can tap into that fundamental aspect of ourselves and within ourselves. Imagine a world that we want to grow into and we want to help create so our children have a different kind of world to thrive in than the one, you know, that we find ourselves in today.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I mean, Lynn McTaggart's work with the intention experiments, where they've done a few peace intention experiments, you know, working with participants from both sides of a conflict to collectively imagine a peaceful resolution, where they've actually tracked, you know, the statistics before the event and statistics after the event, and there has indeed been an improvement in the well, there's been less loss of life, you know, more peace. Now, she's always very careful to say, we have no evidence to be able to say it's because of this that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But the more kind of stories and evidence that we build up, the more, you know, we start to see those connections. In fact, there was a very interesting experience I had, actually, because I was talking when Lynn joined us at Science and Consciousness last year, and hopefully will join us again this year. And it was around the time this conflict blew up in Ethiopia, you may remember, civil war. And I was kind of fairly closely connected to it because I'd just done some work with the leaders of the health system in Ethiopia. And so I said to her, could we do a peace intention experiment, you know, for Ethiopia? And she was very busy at the time. So she kind of said yes, but it wasn't happening, and we didn't manage to get it together. But I got the Ethiopian guys were keen to do something. And I just had an intuition at some point, which was, okay, I'm going to set a date, and I'm going to imagine that we have carried out the peace intention experiment on that date, whether it happens or not. And so I kind of shared that with Lynn, told her that. And anyway, you know, we didn't end up doing a big Lynn McTaggart peace intention experiment thing. However, around the date that I had set for, you know, to imagine that it had happened, suddenly, you know, the conflict dropped off, the rebels kind of withdrew to their area, things started, it's still not completely improved, but the rebels were advancing on the capital, and so things calmed down for a bit, and I was, well, I don't know. You know, I don't know whether that caused that, because we can't prove it in any way, but it was a very interesting synchronicity that just, you know, I have a feeling that we can actually do a lot more than we choose to believe we can, you know, just by connecting the field of Lynn McTaggart's peace experiment through my intention to this peace intent, you know, the field of the peace intent, the morphogenetic field, as people have been referring to in the chat, which exists now around Lynn McTaggart's peace intention experiments, linking that field to the conflict in Ethiopia, just making the connection in that way at the informational level can have an impact. And we suddenly start to realize, wow, there's a lot more that I think we could be doing, which is why this theme of making weird the norm is so important. What happens if we just accept that it is that way? Each of us individually, how would that change the way we show up? How would that way change the way we do things? You know, it's easy in these conversations and at these events to kind of get excited about it, but when we really kind of, so this is what we're going to do this year, Science and Consciousness as well. It's going to be like a lab where we're going to really try to test ourselves on, okay, let's in this space we have together, you know, with maybe 60, 70 people, let's practice taking weird as the norm. And let's kind of call each other on it as well. Well, but hang on now, are you assuming that weird is the norm, or are you assuming that the other, you know, the disconnected is the norm? What would it mean if we in this moment acted in a way that assumed the weird was the norm? To start to kind of get those collective and individual neuro patterns, as it were, laid down. Yeah, Lynn does groups of 8 to Carol Sue. She does this, she does the groups of 8 around, I can't remember, I put it in the chat, Power of 8. She actually did one of those with us at Science and Consciousness last year. It's a powerful experience. But also, you know, when you've got a group of 8 people and one person has an issue, and then collectively they kind of create an intention around the healing that person, you know, could receive to get a, you know, what would it look like if they were healed from this issue that they're facing, and everybody focuses their intention on that. One of the most consistent things that the groups reported when they did it was that not only did that person get some benefit, but a lot of the individuals who were participating in trying to heal the other person had stuff healed in themselves. So it's not like, you know, we still are in this illusion of causality, cause and effect. We're going to help that person, but it's not that we heal them. It's that healing happens. And healing happens to everybody in that circle who is connected to that field of healing. You know, it's a kind of a non-linear way of looking at it. I think that's a more accurate description of what actually goes on, rather than me healing, you know, them, as it were.
Well, and a comment, Peter, again, I don't mean to emphasize the dark side, but there's so many elements involved here. I was involved with Stanley and a few other researchers with several healers who worked on mice at a distance. And these were mice who had been developed very specifically to have very strong immune systems, et cetera. And they were then injected with an immune suppressing agent, and the healer's job was to focus on them and overcome the immune suppressing agent in a way that made them all healthy, just as you were saying, Peter. They all were to experience the healthy aspect of the healing energy. And in most cases, it was very statistically significant. One man with whom I worked on a variety of PK type project, a man named Dean Kraft, who was very good as a healer, his mice all died. And he reported to us afterwards that it wasn't a surprise to him, because emotionally he's afraid of and hates rats and mice. And so I tell the story because it's indicative of, you know, who we really are, all of our emotional content, all of who we are now and who we can become, that we want to, in a sense, befriend within ourselves, so that the best of who we are and what we have can participate in the kind of experiences, Peter, that you're describing. And that's a part of, you know, our personal development that stands in front of us, so that we can all move into a bigger frame.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks for that, Jim. I think we should probably hand back to Jim in a sec, as we come towards the end. Let me just to let everybody know that if you're interested in the science and consciousness in England this year, and by the way, in September, Lynn McTaggart's holding a big event at the same location because she loved it so much when she was there at Science and Consciousness. We've got a discount running this week on the Science and Consciousness, 10% off it if anybody is interested. There's a link and things you can go to that I'll just share now. So there's the code PsyCons10 and a link. So feel free to to join us there. It's an amazing event. It was fantastic last year. We've got some very interesting results this year from experiments they've done in intensive care units in Spain, where they've had random event generators in the room when people have died, and actually registered significant peaks or order, like Jim was saying, in the fields as people died. That shows you something is happening beyond just the physical reality of somebody passing away. So the scientists who've been involved in that will be there as well. So it'd be lovely to have people join us for that. If you can get over to the UK, it's a beautiful spot.
Yeah.
So
Peter,
yeah.
Can I do one more ad? And this is for free. But starting in September, Matt Robertson and I, we teach the neuroscience course in Ubiquiti. We're going to begin a once a month, in a sense, neuroscience club, which will be an hour to an hour and a half of discussion on most of the topics we just talked about. In my lecture in neuroscience back in September, I focused on neuroweapons, psychokinesis, and all of what that tells us about how the brain, heart, mind system works. And so I invite any of you to participate with us, because it'll be a more open discussion. We'll do a little bit of practice, but mainly it'll be about how is all of this affecting our lives, and how can we work together to improve the level of our enjoyment in life through a more practice awareness of these capacities within us. So any of you let us know who are interested, and Jim might say something about, I think, the newsletter, which will tell about this in a little more detailed fashion. But I just wanted to let you know, we want to keep this discussion going starting in the fall.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Peter. What an extraordinary opening session, Peter. Thank you. To just watch Stanley, kind of hunched over with age, but still bright as a button, and funny and engaging, and loving his life every minute. That's the Stan Krippner that, of course, Jim knows the best, but I've also had the privilege of knowing over the years, and just to have him on warmed my heart. So thank you for that. The general comment that I would make as we bring this to a close, everyone, is that you remember when we started this year at the beginning of 2022, we said that Humanity Rising would really now begin to focus on what we've been calling inner regeneration. It's clear to all of us that the world is in a topsy-turvy state of affairs. We have escalating ecological turbulence. We have a destabilization of the global geostrategic order. We have fluctuations in our economics. We have rising authoritarianism. And every indicator is showing, independent of where you are around the world, that people are suffering increasing emotional, psychological, mental stress. Suicides are going up, drug addiction, domestic abuse, alcoholism, all the indicators are of ill-ease, dis-ease are going up. And what that means is that it's incumbent on us more and more to focus our attention on consciousness, on the inner capacity that we all have, not only to maintain an equilibrium, let's say a psycho-emotional equilibrium, but as Peter and Jim have been pointing out, to actually, with intention, shape your world. And that's an interior quality of being. And that's why we're delighted to be supporting Peter's work there at Broughton Hall, and co-sponsoring the Science and Consciousness conference there. and why, as Jim Hickman just pointed out, we want, starting in September, to make available to all of our students in the Humanity Rising and Ubiquiti community an opportunity once a month just to gather together with someone as knowledgeable as Jim and Matt Robertson, who assists him, to contemplate how our understanding of neuroscience can empower us to navigate an increasingly complex world. You know, Peter made a very important point at the beginning. We've now come to the juncture in human history where not only can the rational mind no longer understand, but I would say the human mind as an individual can no longer understand a world that is transforming itself so fast, and in which knowledge, according to what they're saying, knowledge is doubling every 12 and a half minutes. Just think of what it takes to comprehend that. It can only be comprehended collectively and intuitively through an elevation of consciousness that enables us to hold the whole. So that's the importance of what we're going to be delving into over the next 4 days, is the relationship between what we know about science and what we know about consciousness. And I'm just wondering, Peter, just before we say goodbye, whether you would say something about tomorrow's session.
Oh, yeah, good idea, Jim. Yeah. Yeah, so tomorrow, so we've looked at kind of some of the history, as it were, today. And tomorrow, we've got a professor from Northampton University in the UK, which is the biggest parapsychology department in the UK. They actually have about, I think it's about 15 PhD students really doing kind of serious studies into this. And Callum is his name, will be sharing with us what's on the leading edge right now of the research that they're doing and coming up with. So having had some of the history and the context today, tomorrow we'll be looking at where's the research at right now, and what are his students doing, you know, what's the work that he's doing at the moment at Northampton, and what is that kind of pointing us towards. So that's for tomorrow.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jim. This has been splendid. And Jim, I just want to say, every time I listen to you give the story, like Peter, I learn more about the depth of your experience over at least 50, 60 years now of immersion with not only Stan Groff, but Michael Murphy and Stan Krippner, but also Stan Groff and these other giants of our time. So thanks so much for your work and your life and your contribution to these matters.
Well, Jim,
so
that's what happens as we get older. We begin to realize all of what we experienced, and other people, close friends like you, say, "Whoa, you experienced that?" And I have the same reaction to some of your stories, Jim. So that's the advantage of getting older. I'm a fan of the aging process.
Well, that'll do it for today, everyone. Thank you so much. You're all invited to the after session chat group. Those of you who can join, you'll see the link in the chat box. Stan just put it in. And we'll see everybody else here tomorrow. Same time, same station, for the latest cutting edge research on the paraphenomenal world of elevated consciousness. Thank you all so much. Bye for now.